Hi, welcome to the new episode of Startups Rights. Today, my guest is David from Transition Ventures. Welcome, David.
Hey Javed, great to be here.
Really excited. Really excited. Finally, we're catching up after such a long time. It's been a year now. The last time we had a conversation, and you've been in many different cities doing VC work, and finally you're back in London. Um, so I'm also really excited about your focus right now, which is climate tech. We have a lot of questions around that. But before we start with the question, before we delve into the details, I'm really curious about your background in your own words. So the stage is yours.
Yeah, I think I'll keep it short because I know we'll dive deeper later. But originally from Prague, Czech Republic, moved to the UK for my studies right before COVID, which was kind of great for running in empty central London and kind of horrible for anything else, any sort of socializing, etc. And I studied management for my undergrad at King's College London, and then kind of did my master's, which was a combination of climate science and finance at Imperial. And now I work for an early stage venture capital fund called Transition Ventures.
We both went Imperial. We both did masters in a business really, just different focus areas. Uh,
Exactly, different
yeah,
years, right?
different years too. Different years too. Now you're at Transition Ventures. Very, very cool VC fund. You guys have been backing some exciting companies lately. So tell us a bit more about the fund.
Yeah, sure. So Transition Ventures were an early stage venture fund started 4 or 5 years ago with kind of the thesis that over the next couple of decades, the best companies will kind of be born at the intersection of impact and technology. And we kind of like backing anything that affects the physical world in one way or another, which kind of roughly in terms of verticals means anything in energy, deep tech, robotics, climate, space, etc. We will look at it. In terms of like how we like to differentiate it compared to other funds, on the investment team, it's a small team in general. There's 10 of us, 6 of us on the investment team, and everyone has been part of a generalist VC in the past or kind of founded a company. So some of our partners were at Index Ventures in the past, at Boulderton Capital, USV, Atomico, etc. And then one of our GPs started a company called Unity, which is this game engine software with 2 billion in revenues. Sequoia invested back in 2009. And then on the other side, we have venture partners who are these deeply technical founders and operators from companies like Tesla, Redwood Materials, Northvolt, etc. And so we're kind of combining the two to hopefully invest in the best companies across Europe and in the US as well. And kind of, hopefully with the kind of investing and entrepreneurial experience that we have on the team, kind of help the founders build legendary companies. In terms of kind of what is our sweet spot, we invest pre-seed to Series A, 1 to 8 million initial checks, and yeah, and kind of anything that affects the physical world is the sweet spot.
I have more questions around the stuff you guys invest in and also like climate tech investing in general. But before we kind of talk about that, what I'm curious about is I think last time we caught up, you were also working as a VC. You were in Sweden, I believe, and you've you know you worked at some top European VC funds before. And what I'm curious about is, was working in venture always a plan, or did it come about kind of like more organically?
Yeah. I mean, I think venture was never the plan. Like I know for, Harry Stebbings from 20 VC, like he started the podcast when he was like 14. When I was 14, like I had no idea what venture was, as I said, kind of initially from Prague, where let's say the startup ecosystem is not as developed as it is in London or elsewhere. But to be honest, what I was excited about when I was 14 was startups. Like I was kind of reading a lot of magazines and reading a lot about the kind of most exciting companies of the era, which were kind of Airbnb and Uber, etc. But I had no idea how these companies were financed. I just really enjoyed, reading about Brian Chesky and others. And so I guess like when venture kind of initially came on my radar was after my undergrad. I did an internship in consulting and then in growth investing, and then after that during my masters, I was part of the entrepreneurs and venture societies at Imperial, and that's when I really kind of started to delve into the world. Um, and after that, I kind of it still like wasn't clear to me that venture was what I wanted to do. I was kind of thinking also about startups, and the opportunities there. And so right after my masters, when I finished at Imperial, I joined a company called Fuse Energy, which back then was this small team, 20, 30 people. I think it was, when I was there, it was 5 to 10 million in revenue. And they were basically building, or they're building, a kind of new renewable electricity supplier here in the UK. And I was, when I was thinking about like what sort of startup to join, this kind of fit all the different buckets where it was kind of in energy that I was the most excited about. It had an experienced founder. Alan, the founder, was the third employee of Revolut, then was there for 7 years, ended as the chief revenue officer, and then kind of started to use afterwards. The company was in the same office where Revolut started back in the day, and it very much had this like hardcore, Silicon Valley startup culture that I also wanted to experience during the internship. And so, everyone was in the office 6 days a week, 8 until 10, then in the evening, and it had this really direct, no bullshit culture. And it seems like the company has done well. Like since I was there, now they're at 400 million in revenues, 5 billion valuation. So great to hear that the team has done well. Although I've never kind of you know I never doubted that they would do well, given how well they were executing. And after that internship, I kind of wanted to try out venture, and so that's when I kind of applied for a couple of different funds, and I was just fortunate enough to kind of get into more of them, and then I decided to move the internships back to back, and in the end ended up, as you said, kind of spending a bit of time doing different internships around Europe before kind of finally ending up full time here at Transition.
Very quickly, I'm curious about, you experience both the operator side of things, work and Fuse Energy, as in you've obviously also been exposed to the VC side of things too. What made you kind of eventually decide to stick with more on the kind of the venture side of things?
Yeah, I think this was kind of more related to the fact that after Fuse, I've done 3 venture internships. And then I just kind of felt like my skill set was more catered towards venture. And like, I mean, venture is super exciting. You get to interact with entrepreneurs on a daily basis and kind of learn from them, etc. So I felt like, yeah, there was a lot drawing me to venture, and in the end, kind of decided to join. I don't think that there was like a specific reason. It kind of happened a bit serendipitously, but yeah.
Fair enough. You know, you had generalist experiences, obviously, at the VC funds. What made you kind of go with the climate investing? Looking at your, as you said, the Fuse Energy experience, it does shows that you have a certain degree of inclination, I guess, to the climate tech investing, climate tech in general. But I'm curious, like, was there any particular reason, or was it just something that you've always been passionate about?
Yeah, I think maybe, I mean, it's a good time to kind of introduce the funds at which I was at. I was at my first internship was at a fund called Norsken in Sweden, and it's this kind of energy focused fund, or impact focused fund, out of Stockholm. And for me, it was kind of very much tied to my master's, which was combination of climate science and finance. So there I kind of got to see what the great energy and climate deals in Europe look like. And I was quite fortunate that at the time, in Stockholm, like all the AI companies were just starting. Lovable was just starting out. The previous intern at Norsken started this company called Lagora, which is doing legal AI, now a unicorn. And Norsken has this house in the center of the city, and so I kind of got to see all of this when I was there. One of the co-founders of Norsken is started or co-founded Klarna. So through that, it was kind of also very much tapped into the ecosystem. And after that, I moved to Munich, where I joined the fund called Speakers Capital, which is this pre-seed stage fund, kind of focusing very generalist. And one of the founders is this guy called Alexander, who back in the day there in Germany, there's these three guys called Zamber brothers. They started Rocket Internet, and basically similarly to the PayPal mafia in the US, Zamber brothers were kind of like the the what started the German startup ecosystem. And basically with Rocket Internet, they were kind of copying businesses in the US, starting them in Europe, and then kind of scaling them up. And through that started companies like Zalando, and others, Delivery Hero as well. And so it was kind of great to be part of this small team, really investing very early. I mean, pre-seed stage is very different to seed and Series A, which I've seen at Norscan. And also it was fun to see some other stuff outside of energy because they were, as I said, generalists, right? So I kind of looked into everything that had to do with AI agents. Um, and yeah, and had a great time there. Also because it's like, given the Rocket Internet um kind of nature of things, that they're doing some of their own incubations, which was also pretty fun to see that, like, a lot of the times when the startup that they would like to invest in didn't exist, like they didn't mind, finding a team and then really kind of incubating a company themselves. And then after that, I ended up at a fund called Early Bird, which is this pan-European, fund, has been around for 25 years. And it's kind of investing, once again, kind of generalist, pre-seed to Series A. And over there, I kind of had a great insight into what a venture fund that has been around for 25 years looks like in terms of the structure, in terms of the great platform team that they have, in terms of the exits that they've also been able to achieve. So throughout my time in, doing these venture internships, I feel like I got the best to see the best of the different stages, different verticals, different cultures, etc. And in the end, I think I kind of narrowed it down to, if I stay in venture, I would like to kind of return back to London, because as much as I love Stockholm and Munich, and I think they're, perhaps nicer cities than London is, I think that still most of the kind of startup stuff is happening here, etc. And then secondly, after doing a lot of the generalist stuff, I realized that, like, even in a generalist fund, you need to specialize in something. And like a lot of the times that something wasn't energy, because energy and climate wasn't hot at the time. And so I kind of realized, okay, but so maybe kind of joining a more deep tech and energy focused fund would be the right journey. And that's when I got connected to transition via a colleague of mine at Picas. And then kind of started chatting with the team, and yeah, and joined last year.
It's fascinating. One thing really quickly caught my eye about what you just said. You said you saw a difference between pre-seed to seed. From seed to Series A, obviously the difference is more kind of obvious. What I'm curious about, what kind of differences did you see between pre-seed and seed?
I mean, I think the difference is massive, because with pre-seed, like, you're kind of trying to find founders that have not even started the company yet, right? And that means when it comes to the sourcing part, so like finding the companies, you really need to be kind of out there scraping a lot, or like, being even tapped into companies from which founders might leave to start a startup, so that, like, you would know that before it kind of happens, and you're there before anyone else. With seed companies, I feel like it's, I mean, the company is already established, the founders are already there. They've most likely already have some kind of traction, or signals that, what they're working on makes sense. Um, so yeah, I think it's a different kind of game.
What I'm understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, essentially what you're saying is pre-seed is very much like you're being a talent investor. You're sourcing the talent instead of the companies themselves, right?
100%. I think you're a talent investor kind of across
Of
stages,
course, obviously, yeah.
and like the later you are, the more other proof
uh,
points you have.
Factors. Fair enough. I mean, you mentioned so many VC analyst, visiting analyst roles. Pickus, Early Bird, you were at Norscan. I have questions about the geographical differences too, but one thing I'm curious about is visiting analyst role is a very fascinating role because I don't think it exists in US. When I was in America, I've never heard of visiting analyst role. I came across it when I moved to London, and it's this interesting role. That's not an internship, but it's also not a really full time job. I mean, it's somewhere in between. It can be 6 to 8 months. It can be a year. It can become a full time job. It cannot become a full time job. It depends on the DC fund. Um, and what I'm curious about, as somebody who's very much familiar with them, I've done them, not just one, but multiple of them. What are your thoughts on them? How should people approach them, and what's the best way to actually make the most of that opportunity?
Yeah. I mean, look, like I've done a lot of different. I mean, of course, there's a difference between the visiting analyst role and like an internship. I still call it an internship. I've done a lot of internships in the past, and personally, I think it's like an incredible way of meeting, really great people, learning a lot, and getting a better understanding of what you're actually interested in doing. It's in a way, it's kind of a speed run, where like in a normal career, you would kind of switch a job once every, 2 or 5 years or whatever. And then you kind of realize, okay, maybe this is not suited towards what I like. Maybe I want to try something different. Here you kind of like get to see what you like or what you don't like within a span of 3 or 6 months or something. So I think personally it's a great opportunity to like see a lot of different things, meet a lot of different people. I think you probably need to be optimizing for A, learning something new, and B, working with incredible people. Um, but as long as you're always kind of aiming for that, I think you can have a great time, and it's an incredible opportunity to learn a lot and explore.
So maybe just to double down on that, like let's say I come in with no understanding, no expectations. I just joined as a visiting analyst role, but my idea is to stay in the VC world, right? How should I approach my learning? How should I approach my, even thinking about startups, the way I start, approaching sourcing, approaching talking to founders, even working with other investors? Like what kind of mindset I should develop to make sure that I can actually position myself well to stay in the VC world,
Good question. I think um, it's just about like being a sponge, right? So kind of when you're in a new environment, kind of asking a lot of questions, trying to get to touch a lot of different things, then figuring out what you're perhaps better at, what you're worse at, etc. And then like, of course, if you're doing more than one internship, like, for example, when you're doing different venture internships, there's like stuff that overlaps. And I think what is important is to kind of understand how the different teams approach basically the same work, right? And like learning from that, kind of calibrating what you like about how one team does it, what you like about how other team does it, and then ultimately like trying to always learn more, because I think it's easy to just kind of stick to you learn something once and then you stick to that. I think this is an incredible opportunity to see how different people do stuff, and then like taking the best from all of them.
Got it. And do you think it's kind of like the right stage where you should think about, is it the sit stage I want to be in? Is it like later stages? Is it do I want to become a generalist, or do I want to specialize? And do you think those are the right ways of thinking about it when you start something like that?
Exactly. I mean, and it's not just about venture, right? Like it's about, I mean, I was in consulting before. It's about like, do I want to do the consulting job or do I want to do something else? Etc. So yeah.
Fair enough. Um, you spent time in Sweden. Last time we talked, you were in streets of Stockholm. You were walking. You've been in Germany. Now you're in UK. There is obviously European culture that's very much shared across all of them. But also, I assume there's some subtle differences between each ecosystem, right? As somebody who's been exposed to all of them, did you experience any? And if there are, could you share anything with us?
Yeah, I mean, it was to me, it was really, really interesting seeing um how similar but also how different the cities are. I have to say in general, I mean, coming to London for my studies, I thought like London is where, everything is kind of done the best, it's the fastest city, etc. And then I kind of had a humbling experience where I thought, maybe the way that how things are done in Munich is better, or maybe like, how stuff is done in Stockholm is better. What I in general liked more about Munich and Stockholm when it comes to startups is kind of tied to the internships as well, where like in Germany and in Sweden, the culture of doing internships is much more kind of, important, or it's much more common. And so that means that, like, it's very common for people to kind of try out different stuff while they're studying, and by the time that they finish their undergrad or masters, kind of have done like 8 or 10 different internships across a whole wide range of different stuff. Versus in the UK, and perhaps in the US as well. I don't know how it works in the US, but in the UK, you're kind of expected to do your spring week during your first year, and then you do your internship, and then you convert it, and that's what you do for the next couple of years. And then usually what that means, or what I think it kind of results in, is that the startup founders in in the UK, like, are mostly in their 30s, versus in Stockholm and in Munich, like, a lot of the great founders started when they're in their 20s, or even sooner. And I think I don't know if it's better, but it definitely, the culture is different. And I think on a per capita basis, in both Munich and Stockholm, there are more people that are excited about startups than in London. Where, like, in London, it's a much larger city. Of course, like, the number of startups is larger, but I think there's a lot of other. It's a little bit of a bubble where you have a lot of other bubbles. Um,
Mm.
so yeah. So in that sense, I would even argue that, Munich and Stockholm are kind of better to be surrounded by startups.
Very interesting points, dude. Very interesting points. Um, actually, now that you say it, it does make sense. The student kind of internships that you do, I have friends that study obviously at European universities, and some of their internships is like during the school year, and it's like a year long. And by the time they start their actual full time things, they already have enough experience to not even have an edge when they apply for just because of all those experiences. I guess to kind of summarize this discussion with one question, you know, um, now I feel like before, you know, the typical kind of transition to venture would be, somebody would be in consulting, somebody would be investment banking, or, you would see kind of like the ex founders become like partners and whatnot. I think now it's kind of changing a bit. You will see people from many different backgrounds becoming venture, capitalists, and also the way people approach, and kind of developing their own edge, their own um, kind of angle is different. Some people are focused on building communities, some people are on writing, some people on, just come from, founding experiences. They started something of their own. Some of them are deep domain expertise. They've been PhDs, did research in something. Um, what are you saying? What's kind of like the high leverage way to build, real signal real fast?
Yeah, I think there's obviously, not one way of doing it, as you said, right? Like, I think a good venture fund would ideally have people from all different backgrounds, right? Kind of, and everyone would be able to, like, chip in their point of view, so that once you're actually deciding about an investment in an investment committee, like, you have a wide variety of different takes. Um, I think, I mean, what I kind of hinted towards already is what I would recommend to people is that, like, the strongest signal is, like, strongest signal is starting a startup yourself, or joining a startup or a scale up as an operator. Um, which I know it's a little bit weird, saying that as someone who's spent not that long in a startup. Um, but I genuinely think that's the kind of the best way how to understand what building companies is like. Get to know a lot of people that are building companies, and then kind of, yeah, positioning you to be a great investor later on down the road.
Fair enough. And obviously, if you're a partner that has built and sold a company, you already have that signal and credibility. Obviously, nobody's gonna really question your understanding of how startups work. But if you're like a junior VC, and in this day and age, I feel like things are very competitive. With AI also has changed the landscape quite a bit. And how do you stand out as a junior VC?
That's a good question. I mean, I'm still figuring it out, right? Like, it's not like I've got it all figured out.
Yeah.
Um, I think how I try to segment it is in venture, like, to be great in venture. I think you need to be good at at least one of those things. I mean, there's different kind of layers to venture. I think there's four main segments to it. One of them is sourcing, then picking, winning, and supporting. And I think as a junior, you spend most of your time sourcing and picking. Um, but it's difficult to say like what is the way to stand out because everyone has different strengths. Um, and so as I said, ideally in a venture team, everyone would be slightly would be great at something slightly different. Um, someone might be great at you know, socializing with people and like going out and like getting deal flow through that. Someone else might be better at, just kind of like scraping LinkedIn and staying at the computer and like doing deep research. And through seeing different funds from the inside, like that's literally how it is. Like everyone kind of has their own way of doing stuff. So I would say what is important is figuring out what your strengths are and then kind of focusing on those.
Got it. Yeah, you mentioned four things. You said sourcing, picking, winning, and what was the fourth one?
Supporting.
Supporting. Very interesting. You said, find your strengths and kind of focus on them. What I'm curious about is, do you kind of double down on your strengths, or do you kind of obviously utilize your strengths, but also try to improve the areas you're lacking in as much as possible too? Or like, what kind of balance do you aim for?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I would argue that it's better to kind of focus on your strengths and then as a team, do all the stuff. But does that mean that like you, there's also a baseline in terms of, like how good you should be at all of those things. So I think it's a combination of both.
Fair enough. That's very interesting. I guess coming to more kind of day to day aspect of your job, I'm sure you see God knows how many decks a month, right? And I feel like now, before I used to look at like the older decks of really successful startups, and God, some of them are just not it, right? I feel like people understand the power of narrative making and just like storytelling much more now. And obviously, it's like knowledge is much more accessible, much more shared. So most decks tend to be quite, good looking, beautiful, right? Um, and I understand, I feel like beautiful deck doesn't really tell much of a story. So what's a green kind of flag in a tactical, pitch decks that immediately kind of makes you want to hop on a call? And on the flip side, what do you see that you're like, let me just ignore, close the tab.
Yeah. Um, I think when it comes to what is great to see. I think yeah, you mentioned it's not all about the design, but I think what is really important is um to really like make things simple because I feel like a lot of the times when founders are working on something, that's basically their whole life. They kind of want to put it all out there, right? And then the decks are, let's say, 30, 40 slides and very detailed, kind of trying to like proving their expertise in the field. But I feel like as an investor who's seeing something for the first time, I think what is more important is that the founder is able to explain in very simple terms what they're actually working on. And so that means kind of really sticking to, let's say, 10, 11 kind of slides max, and then really keeping it simple in terms of design, in terms of the messaging, etc. So that the investor can grasp what the startup is about, even without knowing nothing about the field. And that's even more important with technical stuff, where someone like me who's not coming from a technical background is really able to grasp why the company that you're building is great and is going to be the next $1 billion company, right? And then you can kind of go into more depth during the call other than during the later interactions. But I think the green flag would be kind of keeping it simple. Um, and at the end of the day, it's not just about it's not that much about the deck, right? Like every investor is kind of excited about two things. One of them is the team great, and the other one is the traction, or like are there some kind of commercial proof points that are strong. And then no matter how the deck is going to look, like if you have either of those, I think investors will be excited.
In a seed stage, deep tech climate solution, let's say, right? It's very hard to most of the time have any sort of traction on commercial kind of information on the slides. And you said 10 to 11 slides is kind of like the ideal golden point. I'm curious, like, what kind of composition of slides do you like to see? Like, how much focus on the technical, how much on commercial, how much, what's that kind of balance looks like for you, the ideal balance?
I I don't have a preference. To be honest, I think like if the founders keep it as kind of standard as possible, the best. Then that's kind of the best. Um, what I would say is that if there's one thing that's kind of making you really differentiated, then just put it on the first slide. So like if the thing that's that's great about your company is the traction and like the interaction with your customers, etc., I would put it on the first slide. If your team is extremely strong in the field, etc., I would put it on the first slide. Um,
Okay, got it. Got it. So to kind of highlight and expose your strength as much as possible. Um, Very quickly about the sourcing side of things, because uh, there are a lot of startups out there, but obviously it's very competitive space. It's hard to earn the access to the good startups, and I feel like kind of right to access, the right to kind of invest is becoming quite important. It's not just the capital; it's also like being kind of one of the first, the kind of having the access rights essentially. Um, and what I'm curious about, because you're still kind of, I'm sure you are also thinking about those things quite a lot. Um, in terms of like polishing the sourcing approach, like some people obviously like to go to these forums, hackathons. Some of them like to find people, in universities. Some people like to do research, kind of formulate their own opinions and find specific, what kind of ways do you like to source? What are your favorite methods of sourcing?
yeah, I mean that's a good question. I guess like this is something that I'm still trying to figure out. Um, and so I think I'm kind of like right now I'm trying to balance my time and spend time on different approaches. Of course, one of them is building the network, going to events, meeting people, etc. Which I think perhaps um like the fruits of that are not as immediate because like you get a lot of stuff that is potentially not that interesting. But on the other hand, in the long term, like having a strong network, I think is the differentiator because that's how you get the best deals. On the other hand, when it comes to scraping and going through lists, etc., perhaps not the greatest source in the long term, but it's a kind of great way to yeah, to get into calls immediately and to find potentially attractive companies immediately. So I think right now I'm trying to kind of do both. But of course, as I said, every investor is slightly different. And then in the long term, you want to kind of come up with your own approach to doing things.
Speaking of sourcing, you recently backed Sky Energy. Could you tell us a bit more about that company?
Yeah, sure. That was kind of the first investment after I joined. Um, And it was pretty fun because it was basically my second week in. We spoke with the founder once, based in Stockholm, kind of right in the same building where I was working when I was there. Um, and then kind of after we got excited about the company, we kind of acted fast, moved with conviction, flew in to Stockholm the next day, had a great meeting with the founder. Um, and basically what they're building is kind of like a platform which integrates factory floors to the energy market. So on one side, what the company is able to do is integrate very deeply on the factory floor. So there's different machines, etc. They're able to connect, extract data, etc. And on the other side, they're able to kind of connect to the energy markets and then kind of on autopilot optimize how much energy the company is using at what times and provide flexibility so that the outcome is basically 30 to 40% energy savings for these industrial customers. And what that means in practice is we were speaking to some of their customers and they were super excited about some of the areas where they're starting in are um, greenhouses, pulp and paper, etc. And the founders were super excited because basically for them it was an absolute game changer, being able to save so much on their energy costs, which are a massive cost on their in their financials. So that's one company that I'm really excited about. They're growing nicely as well. I'm very excited about anything that has to do with energy. Given that I've studied my masters, have been at Fuse Energy. So this is one that I would highlight.
You yeah, you mentioned a couple of aspects. You said the customers are happy. The technology is very cool, obviously. What was that kind of gut feeling, that conviction, being like, okay, we got to invest in this company?
Good question. I mean, as I said, it's always a combination of the founder and the traction, right? So I think that was the same here. Personally, once again, coming from Fuse Energy, I think I prefer founders that are kind of a bit spiky, no bullshit, just kind of very direct, getting to execute, etc. And I feel like the founder of Sky is very much like that. So that kind of drew me to him as well. But of course, like I don't want to say that after 2 weeks I came in and it was all about my intuition, etc. Like it's
Yeah.
venture is a team job. This was a team job as well, and I was just the cog in the machine. So um, yeah,
I don't diminish.
I want to take the credit, but I was very excited that we got to partner up with the company.
No, I'm sure. I mean, your instinct was obviously in the right as well. Um, in terms of climate tech, where does pure VC make sense, and where, you know founders need to be thinking about other sorts of financing, whether it's project finance, strategic capital, grants, etc.
Yeah, I think it's yeah. I mean, the answer to this is pretty simple. Where like VC financing is best catered towards kind of software and AI businesses, which don't require that much capital, are really scalable, etc. I think a lot of the stuff that we, by the way, we do a lot of software stuff as well. But I think a lot of the other stuff that we do is much more kind of hardware and deep tech, heavy companies. And for those, a lot of the times, some other forms of financing are also necessary. So, could be a combination of all the ones that you mentioned. The difficult part is, of course, that, like, as a company, you want to be executing and building the thing that you want to be building, and like the more forms of financing you're kind of trying to get, that kind of takes up more of your time. I know, for example, that grants, of course, are great in that, you don't have to give up any equity, but on the other hand, the process to get grants requires a lot of bureaucracy, etc. um but but I'd say that, in general, kind of these more hardware heavy and deep tech companies are need to experiment more with the different forms of financing.
Got it. Well, I'm gonna ask you my final question. And this is interesting to me personally, because I feel like when people say climate tech, they just say climate tech, but climate tech is an ecosystem of different technologies. There's a fintech, carbon trading, credit trading. There's AI software optimization of grid technologies. There's freshwater technologies. There's like deep tech, fusion reactors. There's so much there, right? And obviously different subsectors have different levels of traction, different levels of funding, etc. Personally, in your perspective, I'm curious about your perspectives, your souls. Which subsectors you are really, really excited about, and which subsectors you're like, you're not really seeing much happening right now.
Yeah. I think the one sector where, there's not much happening right now that I feel like might be a little misunderstood is, for example, residential energy, where like 10 years ago or 5 years ago, there was a lot of these companies popping up which kind of, did residential solar and heat pumps, etc. And then all those kind of died out as the kind of early adopters already got their solar and their heat pumps, etc. Subsidies decreased from the government, and whatnot. And so now investors are kind of cautious of this whole space because the growth has really slowed down. But I still think that it's a massive opportunity. I'm a little bit of a solar maximalist. Um, and so I think there's a lot of space to grow in that space. So would kind of say that, you know, the level of investor attention that it's getting right now is, you know, should be higher. On the other side of the coin, one sector that I'm quite excited about is robotics, which I'm not the only one. It's, you know, in general a pretty hyped up sector right now. And I think in robotics, there's just, you know, kind of with AI, we had this ChatGPT moment where, you know, everyone went to ChatGPT for the first time, and it was this incredible tool that kind of, you know, has shown everyone the potential of AI. And I feel like we are yet to see that in robotics, where, you know, we do have certain sort of robots in manufacturing. Now we're getting some first humanoids, etc. Most of them are not super useful yet, but I think in the future, what we'll achieve is kind of having robots that are much easier to program, etc., by kind of building these large physical AI models and then kind of doing some vertical fine tuning for specific use cases. And we're not quite there yet. The bottleneck is, of course, you require a lot of data. With LLMs, you were able to kind of scrape that from the internet. You're not quite able to do it with robotics. So it'll still kind of take a bit of time to get there, but any sort of companies which are building the picks and shovels for robotics, I'm incredibly excited about.
I feel like the last thing you mentioned, we can make another episode around it. It's a fascinating topic, but we are unfortunately at the end of our episode, and it's been a very interesting episode. Both catching up with you, David, and also learning about your perspectives. So thank you so much for your time and insights.
Javid, it was great catching up, and thanks a lot for having me.
Of course, man. We'll see each other in person soon.
See you then.